Okay, picture this. You're at a crowded networking event, and you've just awkwardly spilled a tiny bit of your drink right on your shirt. Or maybe you're walking into a completely silent university classroom on the very first day of the semester. You look around, and everyone else looks, well, entirely poised, right? They're chatting, they seem effortlessly confident, and they clearly belong there. Meanwhile, you are quietly panicking inside, totally convinced that you're the only one who feels out of place. Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to grab a coffee, sit down, and explore the incredibly fascinating psychology behind why we so often feel exactly like this.
It's a question almost every single one of us asks ourselves at some point. Why does everyone else seem so incredibly confident? You see, our brains are naturally wired by evolution to constantly evaluate our social standing, mostly just to reduce uncertainty in our environments. When we look around a room, whether we're starting a new job, maybe changing careers, or just showing up at a social gathering, we kind of naturally assume that everyone around us has their lives completely figured out, while we feel like this anxious, messy work in progress.
But here's the catch. We're actually unfairly comparing two entirely different things here. We're weighing our own messy, hidden internal feelings against the carefully curated public performances of everyone else. Think about it. You only have direct access to your own mind. You feel your own doubts, your fears, and your hesitations really intimately. But you only get to see the polished external facade that other people choose to project. Honestly, it's a completely rigged comparison from the start. And that brings us to a really foundational concept in psychology known as pluralistic ignorance. It was actually introduced nearly a century ago by social psychologist Floyd Allport. Basically, it describes a state where group members systematically misestimate their peers' attitudes, feelings, and private behaviors. It's essentially a massive collective misperception. You genuinely believe that your private thoughts and insecurities are wildly different from everyone else's, even though your public behaviors and theirs, by the way, look exactly the same. To see how this plays out in the real world, just think about the silent classroom paradox. Imagine you're sitting in a really highly complex lecture, and the professor asks, "Are there any questions?" Now, you are completely bewildered, but you don't raise your hand, right? Mostly because you just want to avoid the embarrassment. You look around, and nobody else is raising their hand either. So you mistakenly assume that everyone else completely understands the material. But the reality? Literally everyone is confused, but everyone thinks they are the only confused one in the room. The psychological mechanism behind that agonizing silence is called the illusion of transparency. This is our tendency to overestimate how closely our public behavior actually reflects our private experience. So when we're sitting in that classroom or maybe standing up giving a big presentation, we falsely assume that our internal anxiety is completely obvious to everyone else in the room. We vastly, wildly underestimate our own ability to mask our feelings. The truth is, you actually look just as calm to them as they look to you. This whole dynamic is actually summarized beautifully by the American humorist Olin Miller. He said, "You probably wouldn't worry about what people think of you if you could know how seldom they do." We fall into what you might call a scrutiny trap. We walk around thinking all eyes are on us, noticing our every tiny misstep. But in reality, people are entirely too busy worrying about their own social standing to even notice yours. Psychologists have a great name for this, the spotlight effect. It's a really powerful egocentric bias where we tend to believe that others are paying much, much more attention to us than they actually are. We basically walk around in our own little personal spotlights. And because our judgments are so naturally anchored to our own experiences and our own intense self-awareness, we end up with this highly exaggerated view of our own visibility and significance to the people around us. Let's actually look at how this plays out in a laboratory setting because it's pretty funny. In a classic late 1990s study by Thomas Gilovich and his colleagues, researchers literally forced college students to walk into a room wearing a highly embarrassing t-shirt featuring the musician Vanilla Ice. Afterward, they asked the students, "Hey, how many of your peers do you think actually noticed the shirt?" Well, the students vastly overestimated the number. They felt like these glowing beacons of embarrassment, but because everyone else in the room was completely wrapped up in their own worlds, very few people actually even noticed. Okay, moving on to part one, the competence paradox, skill versus confidence. So, we've established that we completely misread social situations and way overestimate how much people judge us. But what about our actual abilities? Enter impostor syndrome. This is the subjective experience of perceived self-doubt in one's abilities and accomplishments, despite objective evidence suggesting the exact opposite.
Highly competent, incredibly successful people often feel like complete frauds who are just somehow deceiving everyone else about their intelligence. And while early research back in the 1970s thought this was mostly experienced by high-achieving women, modern research shows that this phenomenon is actually evenly distributed across all genders. To really understand how this works in practice, researchers use something called the impostor phenomenon assessment, which breaks this internalized fear down into 3 core factors. First up, intense doubts about achievement. Basically feeling like you constantly have to over-prepare or work twice as hard as others just to get by. Second is perceived discrepancy, which means you totally discount your own achievements by attributing your success strictly to external factors. Things like sheer luck. And third, self-handicapping behaviors. These usually manifest as extreme perfectionism or even procrastinating out of a deep, deep fear of finally being exposed as a fraud. Now notice the stark contrast here. On one side, we have imposter syndrome. These are individuals with very high skill but incredibly low confidence. On the other side, we have its exact psychological mirror image, the Dunning-Kruger effect, where individuals have low skill but uniquely high confidence. Placing them side by side like this really highlights how wildly our actual skill levels can skew our own self-assessment. Now, it is incredibly important to define the Dunning-Kruger effect accurately, mostly because it's so often misunderstood in popular culture. It's defined as the tendency of people with low ability in a specific area to give overly positive assessments of this ability. It is definitely not a claim about general intelligence. It absolutely doesn't mean stupid people are too stupid to know they're stupid. Instead, it's a metacognitive failure. Poor performers simply lack the required expertise to even recognize their own qualitative shortcomings in specific tasks. You can actually clearly see the statistical mismatch in David Dunning and Justin Kruger's original study. They tested undergraduate students on logical reasoning, grammar, and humor. The participants who scored in the bottom 12th percentile, literally the absolute lowest performers, actually ranked themselves in the 62nd percentile. Crazy, right? Because they just didn't know enough about the subject to spot their own errors, they confidently and very incorrectly assumed they were performing well above average.
Right, let's jump to part 2, the modern amplifier, social media.
So if our brains already struggle to accurately read a room in real life, what on earth happens when we put those same brains online? Well, let's walk through this timeline to see exactly how digital environments completely hijack our wiring. On day 1, individuals post online, but nuance rarely gets attention, so mostly extreme or highly confident views are shared. By day 2, platform tools like likes and shares heavily reward this unshakable confidence. On day 3, the algorithms, which are designed entirely to maximize engagement, push this evocative content to the very top of our feeds. And finally, by day 4, a totally false baseline for social comparison is firmly established in our minds. What this actually means is that we are constantly, day in and day out, comparing our internal realities to a completely non-representative sample. The most prominent, visible, and frankly, the loudest members of a group disproportionately influence our perceptions of the whole group. This loud fringe on the internet creates massive, macro-level pluralistic ignorance. We scroll through our feeds and we mistakenly conclude that this extreme, unyielding confidence and success is just the average human experience. But I promise you, it really isn't. Which brings us to part 3, the illusion of confidence, a mutual performance. When we pull all these psychological threads together, we arrive at this genuinely incredible insight from social identity researchers Terry and Hogg. They note that depersonalization occurs. A person's feelings and actions are guided more by group prototypes and norms than by personal factors. What they're saying is, when you see people acting incredibly confident in public, they aren't necessarily feeling that way on the inside. Very often, they're just defaulting to their social identity. They are conforming to the expectations of the group rather than expressing true, unwavering internal certainty. So the absolute ultimate takeaway I want you to remember from all of this is right here. Confidence is very often a mutual performance. That poised, self-assured facade that literally everyone puts up, it's largely just an act of impression management. We are all essentially standing in that silent classroom together, putting on a really brave face and carefully masking the shared internal anxieties and doubts that almost every single human being experiences. Which leaves us with one final kind of provocative thought to chew on. If the spotlight effect is a mere illusion,
If the most skilled among us secretly feel like imposters, and if everyone else is largely just pretending to have it all completely figured out, what would happen if you finally forgave yourself for feeling unsure?